Hi, my name is Chris Dixon. This is Founder Stories. Today we have Chet Kanojia, the founder and CEO of Aereo. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
So what's Aereo?
Aereo, we just launched in New York City. It's a way consumers can get over-the-air, free-to-air broadcast television for a very rational price on any device that they want, along with a DVR, so you can watch all the major networks, sports, etc. for today a price of $12 a month on iPads, iPhones, soon to be on other platforms as well.
Yeah, so I actually tried it for a day. I got a trial account, and so I was watching, like, I think when the Knicks had Jeremy Lin or whatever, I was watching the Knicks game, and it looked great. It was like totally. So how does it work? So you have it's kind of unusual in that you actually built a data center with antennas.
Yeah.
Right?
So the basis is that any consumer today can just go put an antenna up, and the signal, depending on where you're in New York, is maybe great, may not be great. But so we basically miniaturized. Actually, I may have a version of this thing here, but. That's a dual band ATSC antenna, which tunes.
And this is something you designed and.
Yeah, our team does all the RF signal processing, all the engineering is done in-house, and so we designed these and we miniaturize them so we can pack lots of them into a small location. So here in Brooklyn, we have a data center that we can serve hundreds of thousands of people out of. And so consumer comes and basically they're assigned an antenna and all the circuitry that goes with that and storage for their DVR function, so they can come in and think about it as just remotely controlling your own.
Yeah. And so, for I guess legal reasons, every consumer has a designated antenna.
Correct.
And so, your argument architecturally is that it's the same as having it at home, except
just a long cord.
You just have
a remote connection to it. Yeah.
And I don't know if you can talk about it, but you just won a lawsuit. I guess
Well, we defeated a motion for a preliminary injunction, and the basis was that the court found that our technology was kind of just worked as advertised, and it was fairly squarely within existing precedent what was legal. So
yeah. So there have been some like Silicon Valley tech blogs and things that have called. I think they called you a loophole business, which I think the argument being that. That you found a loophole in the regulatory framework, and I guess the reason that those people are skeptical is that I'm paraphrasing here, but I think they sort of see it as like there's this corrupt structure, the TV industry, sort of Silicon Valley views it, right? And you're just sort of putting a little lipstick on the pig or whatever, as opposed to trying to reinvent it from scratch or something. I guess that's the criticism.
I actually do think we are, all opinions are welcome as far as I'm concerned, but we are, I think, inventing it from scratch because we're taking it back to the basic principle that said, look, there was a deal between the government and the broadcasters. They got spectrum to broadcast. And
can you walk through that a little bit? So like going back pre-cable, right?
Way back, 1932.
So the government said you
can have spectrum for no cost, which who knows what it's worth, tens and tens of billions, maybe 100. And but the deal is you program in the public interest. You provide free-to-air television.
And so, for example, you allow like the president to talk and local news. And
localism is a very important.
For a long time, they had the balanced, like you had to show as many Democrats as Republicans or something to get rid of that.
I don't know about, but the idea was that you're a neutral platform, right? And so that was the starting point. And
but now we have cable. Like what, 85% of people in the U.S. get their TV from cable?
Some source of multi-channel video, which is cable, satellite, Fios, whatever that happens to be. But the basic tenets still apply, and with that responsibility, with that right, comes the responsibility as well that they're supposed to provide consumers with free-to-air television. The problem has been historically that, and this is kind of how cable started actually, right? The picture was fuzzy back in the 50s and 60s, and if you lived in an area where you couldn't get good reception, the cable guy came, knocked on your door, and said, "Hey, I got this clever thing for you. $5 a month, I can give you a pipe, and you can get a clean picture." Consumer said, "Cool, clean picture. That's worth my while, and I'll take it."
Did the cable guys start out with the? Did they just sort of do like similar to you, like a hack where they had?
I wouldn't call it a hack, but I think it was.
But in the same way that they just took the broadcast and
it was a distinct, different technology. It was a community antenna.
Yeah.
And in fact, the cable industry is technically known as CATV, community antenna television. And so that was really the starting point. And when the audience
did they cut deals with all of the content and broadcasters?
No. So the history is throughout.
So they sort of did it like you did, like in other words, like sort of took advantage of existing regulations.
They were serving the consumer, and and life was great. And then at some point the industry evolved, and because the balance of power had shifted in cable's favor, the government came out with this thing called retransmission consent, which basically allowed the broadcasters to then have power to say they can either withhold the signal or demand retransmission consent. But really what happened was that was sort of the turning point in the industry, because instead of just getting compensated for the signal with the broadcasters, the entire media industry did was they launched 500 channels. They came out and said, you know, I've got a channel for this, I've got a channel for cats, dogs, cats that speak Spanish, cats that, you know, every possible thing that you can imagine. But instead of asking for money for carriage, they said, you know, you can have ABC, but how about you carry these 14 other channels from us? The catch is you're going to have to pay for all 14, and next year the price is going to go up, and the next year the price is going to go up. So suddenly the consumer, on the other hand, has had no voice in this whole equation, right? Whereas what they really watch, a bulk of it, you know, a good 30%, 40% of people, is that broadcast, which, by the way, happens to be free to air, and they can just get an antenna and do it. So when I was running my last company, I saw this evolve into, we used to collect data. We had pioneered how to collect.
It was, by the way, it was a company that did TV advertising technology there.
Like all startups, it went through a couple of steps, but the origin was I'd created a protocol that allowed for efficient collection of or transmission of data, asynchronous data, on shared networks, and we applied to RF networks, cable RF networks as a start.
And that company was acquired by Microsoft.
It became part of Microsoft.
$100 million or something.
That's right, in early 2000 and early 2008. And so I used to look at all this data, and the data was pretty obvious that, you know, 25, 27, 30%, depending on the day of the week, people only watched broadcasts. 7 or 8 channels was all 80% of what people wanted and watched, but they had hundreds of channels, VOD, all this other stuff. And the pricing had just gotten irrational. As a consumer, I thought of it, the pricing was just utterly irrational. And so as I sold my company and I was sort of thinking about what to do next, I said, well, the internet's at a place where people are consuming video on it. There are library services, Netflix, Hulu, etc., things like that. But what's really lacking and missing is that pulse, that live pulse that people like, whether it's a football game on a Sunday or a big sitcom or the Oscars or whatever. But on the other hand, they could just go get an antenna, except it's clumsy, technologically inferior. And so what if I solve that particular problem? And if I can solve that problem, at least for a significant segment of that population, I'll have created an alternative. So going back all the way, right, the idea here is if you create this alternative, new programming, new interesting things will emerge and create a parallel ecosystem for this generation that is, and you know, I'm not 25 anymore, but I do consider the ability for me to pick and choose what I want to spend money on and consume is important.
Yeah.
So, you know, going back to your original question for the Silicon Valley blogs or whoever they were, and by the way, they're not the only ones who have a monopoly on that comment that they've made about us. But this really is a way of basically starting a conversation, putting a wedge in there in a closed system to say now we can take the linchpin of that closed system out, set it free, and then let's see what happens, what develops as part of that.
Yeah, as I recall, I think like, I don't know, I'm not an expert on it, but like VoIP interacting with, interfacing with POTS systems was originally kind of a regulatory hack. I think online trading was originally a regulatory, it was like technically, you know, they had to get around some technicality, and then what happens in those cases, I think, is that once the market gets big, I mean, I think the sort of naive view is that the business just follows the law, and the more sophisticated view is sometimes the law follows business, follows markets.
Typically that's what happens. I think it's not lost on people when there is a lot of consumer demand, and those consumer demands need to be encouraged and protected.
Yeah, because almost all sort of regulatory business law is centered around the what's best for the consumer. Right?
Exactly. That's sort of the basic thesis, is that it's what's best for the consumer. And by the way, that at times is what's best for businesses, because to be able to enable good quality programming free to air, those businesses need to be protected and taken care of. But the basic deal still is in place, which is, and is likely to be in place, because if you look at all these contracts, they extend, you know, till 2025 or beyond, that consumer interest needs to be protected. So that's.
And so you see it as, well, as sort of you said, mentioned as a wedge. So potentially, you know, once you've built up, let's say, you know, millions of people paying for your service, you could layer all sorts of other services on top.
I think we'll do that a lot sooner.
Okay, that don't use the antenna, for example.
Exactly.
Like you could have a deal with Netflix, or do you see it as primarily for people that are sort of cord cutters or whatever? Or
we haven't really marketed the product today, hopefully soon, but what we find is it's a mix of 50-50. So 50% of the people that are either cord cutters, nevers, shavers, whatever you want to call them, they've made the conclusion in their mind that that package model is no longer important to them or works for them. And then about 50% is the convenience guys that are essentially saying, look, this is such a simple way for me to do this, that I understand it's a limited amount of programming. It's the 7 major channels that I really care about, or 5, but it's 5 out of 8. But the convenience beats not being tethered to home, and so they'll get it as a supplement at times.
Yeah. Can you explain the logic on if you're Rupert Murdoch or something, right, who owns broadcast channels? Why won't this? Okay? So one counter argument to what you're doing is these are legacy regulations that were based on a system where people got most of their TV through broadcasting. Aren't they going to go away in a world of internet video and broad cable penetration?
Well,
but I think the argument is there's lots of vested interest in the current regulatory framework.
There is a lot of vested interest, and I think rightfully so. There is a lot of momentum against change along those lines, because if you look at even the current ecosystem, you have cable distributors on one side and you have networks owners on the other side, and they're not necessarily, sometimes they're co-owned, but their interests are different. I mean, which is why you see all these regular spats between broadcasters and cable companies when they drop the signal because they can't, they complain that retransmission fees are too high or whatever that happens to be. So the incentives aren't aligned to completely overall wholesale change the system, which is why somebody like us coming in and starting that conversation and creating an alternative for the consumer is a good thing.